What does it take to turn a man into a monster? Or perhaps the better question is, what does it take to reveal that the real monsters were there all along? In the summer of 1851, in the fated swamps of northern Florida, a slave named Jacob made a choice that would rewrite the boundaries between victim and executioner. He didn't use a gun. He didn't use poison. He used the ancient, cold-blooded predators that had ruled those waters since before men walked the earth, and he taught them to prefer the taste of his master's flesh. This isn't a story about alligators going rogue. This is a story about a man who weaponized nature itself, who spent years cultivating trust with creatures most men feared, feeding them carefully, conditioning them, training them to associate the scent of white plantation owners with fresh meat. 12 men vanished into those dark waters. 12 families received bodies so mutilated that closed casket funerals became the standard. And for months, no one suspected the quiet, obedient slave who tended the gator pits. If you're ready for this journey into one of America's darkest and most suppressed historical secrets, a tale of revenge so calculated it took years to execute, so brutal it was deliberately erased from official records, subscribe now and comment where you're listening from. Because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about power, survival, and the lengths a desperate man will go to reclaim his humanity. Picture Florida in 1851. Not the Florida of theme parks and retirement communities, but a brutal frontier where Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from cypress trees, where the air itself felt thick enough to choke on. The northern panhandle was plantation country, cotton and sugarcane fields stretching toward horizons that shimmered with heat and human misery. This was a world where human beings were bought and sold with less ceremony than livestock, where the crack of an overseer's whip punctuated the rhythm of daily life like a metronome of suffering. The Okefenokee Swamp sprawled across the Georgia-Florida border, a primordial landscape of black water and infinite shadows where civilization's rules bent and sometimes broke entirely. Here, alligators grew to lengths that defied belief. 16 feet of prehistoric killing machine, and they were everywhere. In the irrigation ditches, in the rice paddies, sunning themselves on the banks of every creek and canal. The enslaved people who worked these lands lived in a state of constant negotiation with death. They drowned in flooded fields. They died of heat stroke. They were beaten, starved, worked until their bodies simply gave out. And sometimes, they were fed to the gators as punishment, a terror tactic whispered about in slave quarters, but never spoken of in polite society. In this landscape of Spanish moss and screams, where the boundary between human and animal was deliberately blurred by those in power, one man learned to speak the language of monsters. The Harrington family owned the largest plantation in Columbia County, over 3,000 acres of prime bottomland worked by nearly 200 enslaved people. They were considered good people by the standards of their time and class. Church-going, hospitable, known for hosting elaborate hunting parties where wealthy planters from Georgia and the Carolinas would gather to shoot game and discuss politics over imported brandy. James Harrington, the patriarch, had a reputation as a fair master, which meant he didn't separate families unless absolutely necessary, and he only used the whip for what he considered serious infractions. His 4 sons, Thomas, William, Robert, and Charles, were being groomed to take over various aspects of the plantation's operations. They were handsome men, educated at good schools, fluent in the language of gentility and entitlement. But there was something else about the Harrington men, something the enslaved population knew intimately, but could never speak aloud. They had peculiar tastes when it came to discipline. They enjoyed it. Not just the compliance, not just the power, but the actual act of inflicting pain. They would gather to watch punishments the way other men gathered to watch cockfights, passing a bottle between them, making wagers on how long a person could remain conscious. And they had a special fondness for using the natural world as their instrument, forcing men to stand in fire ant hills, leaving people staked out under the sun until their skin blistered and split. And yes, threatening to feed troublemakers to the gators that infested every waterway on the property. The Harrington's alligator operation wasn't a secret. It was a business venture, and a profitable one at that. Starting in the late 1840s, There was a growing demand for alligator hides in the northern states and in Europe. The leather was prized for its durability and distinctive texture, used for boots, belts, saddlebags, even decorative items for wealthy homes. So the Harringtons did what any entrepreneurial plantation owners would do: they turned their pest problem into profit. They established a series of reinforced pens along the Suwannee River tributary that cut through their property, where captured alligators were held and fattened before being harvested for their skins. The operation required specialized knowledge and fearless handlers. Most enslaved people were terrified of the creatures, which made sense. These were apex predators that could take a man's leg off with a single bite, that could perform a death roll and drown a full-grown human in seconds. But the Harringtons needed someone to manage the operation, to feed the gators, to maintain the pens, to know when an animal was ready for slaughter. That someone was Jacob. He was given this role not as a privilege, but as a test of nerve, possibly as a punishment for some forgotten infraction. The official story was simple: Jacob was the alligator tender. He fed them scraps from the plantation's butchering operations, spoiled pork, chicken remains, occasionally a dead mule or horse. He kept the pens secure. He harvested the hides when instructed. It was dangerous work, the kind that could end with a man being dragged into dark water and never seen again. But it was work that kept him at the margins of plantation life, away from the cotton fields, away from the constant surveillance of overseers. And that distance, that marginal space between human society and the wild, that was where Jacob's real education began. The gator pens weren't just holding facilities. They were a deliberately designed system of terror. There were 7 main enclosures, each connected by gates and channels that allowed water to flow between them, but kept the larger alligators separated to prevent them from killing each other. The pens were positioned strategically along the property's waterways, hidden from the main plantation house by dense vegetation, but accessible via a network of footpaths known only to those who worked them. The largest pen, the one closest to the swamp's deep water, held what the enslaved population called the ancients, massive alligators that had been captured years earlier, some measuring over 15 feet in length. These weren't just animals. They were legends unto themselves, creatures that had survived long enough to reach truly monstrous proportions. The Harrington sons kept detailed records of the operation in leather, bound ledgers, numbers of animals captured, hides processed, profits earned. But there were other notations too, cryptic entries that hinted at a darker purpose. Discipline enacted, river pen, witnessed by TH and WH. Problem slave resolved, no further action needed. Demonstration effective, no repeat incidents. The infrastructure included not just the pens themselves, but also a small shed where Jacob lived, positioned so he could hear if any of the gates were breached during the night. There were feeding platforms, long poles with hooks for maneuvering carcasses, and crucially, a butchering station where animals brought in from the plantation's hunting expeditions were processed. This is where Jacob learned anatomy, where he learned to distinguish between different types of meat, different scents, different textures, where he began to understand that these prehistoric killing machines were in the end simply animals, powerful, dangerous, but governed by patterns and instincts that could be learned, anticipated, and eventually manipulated. The infrastructure of control worked both ways. The Harringtons had built it to terrorize and profit. Jacob would learn to use it for something else entirely. When plantation owners occasionally vanished while inspecting their property, there was a ready-made explanation that required no investigation, no uncomfortable questions. Florida in the 1850s was genuinely dangerous territory. Men drowned in the swamps. They were bitten by cottonmouths and rattlesnakes. They suffered heat stroke and simply wandered off into the wilderness in states of delirium. And yes, they were occasionally taken by alligators. This was an accepted hazard of managing property that bordered on true wilderness. The Okefenokee region was notorious for its dangers. Even experienced hunters and trappers sometimes failed to return from expeditions into its depths. So when a visiting planter from South Carolina disappeared after a night of heavy drinking and a dawn inspection of the gator pens, the explanation was obvious: tragic accident, poor judgment, wrong place at the wrong time. When one of the Harrington sons' associates went missing after riding out to check on a property boundary dispute, the story was the same: must have fallen from his horse near the water, probably dragged under before he could even cry out. The peculiar thing was how clean these disappearances were. No witnesses, no signs of struggle on the banks, just absence. But in a landscape where death lurked in every shadow, where nature itself seemed hostile to human life, this didn't raise suspicions. It confirmed what everyone already believed: the swamp was deadly, and even powerful white men weren't immune to its dangers. The enslaved population knew better. They noticed patterns that the plantation owners couldn't see, or wouldn't allow themselves to see. They noticed that the disappearances clustered around certain times, always after Jacob had been seen in the main house or near the overseer's quarters, always after some particularly brutal punishment had been enacted. But knowing and speaking were two different things. So they watched in silence, and they waited, and some of them began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, the most dangerous predator in those swamps wasn't the one with scales and teeth. Her name was Sarah, and she worked in the main house as a kitchen servant. She'd been born on the Harrington Plantation, had watched 3 of her children sold away to cover gambling debts, had absorbed more cruelty than most humans could survive without shattering completely. She was 56 years old, ancient by the standards of enslaved life, and she'd learned long ago that survival required careful observation and strategic silence. Sarah was the one who first noticed that Jacob was taking more than just animal scraps to the gator pens. She'd see him wrapping packages in burlap, items that seemed too carefully prepared to be mere refuse. She noticed that he'd request specific cuts when animals were butchered, always portions that included bone, skin, and fat in particular ratios. She said nothing, but she began to pay attention to the calendar, to the timing of Jacob's requests, and the timing of the disappearances. And then one night, after William Harrington had beaten her grandson so severely that the boy couldn't stand, she sought Jacob out in his shed by the pens. The conversation they had was never recorded, never witnessed, but its effects rippled through the following months. Sarah began to provide Jacob with information: which plantation owners were visiting, what their schedules looked like, when they planned to inspect the property. She gave him access to the clothing worn by the Harrington men, items that carried their scent. She even arranged for certain visitors to be served particularly heavy doses of whiskey the night before their morning tours of the Gator operation. Was this complicity? Collaboration? Or was it something else? A shared understanding between 2 people who had watched their humanity be systematically denied, who had reached a point where traditional morality became irrelevant in the face of institutional evil. Sarah never asked Jacob directly what he was doing, but one evening, after another disappearance, she brought him a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth and said simply, "The swamp is hungry. Best we feed it what it's owed." It was the closest they ever came to acknowledging the truth. They weren't innocents. Let's be clear about that from the start. The 12 men who disappeared between March 1850 and August 1851 were architects and enforcers of slavery, men who had built their wealth and status on the systematic brutalization of human beings. But they were also human, complex, flawed, with families who loved them and lives that extended beyond their worst actions. Thomas Harrington, age 32, was the eldest son and the most educated. He'd studied law briefly in Savannah and fancied himself an intellectual. He was also the one who'd designed the plantation's punishment protocols, who'd written detailed instructions on how to maximize compliance through calculated applications of pain. His wife was pregnant with their 4th child when he vanished. William Harrington, age 28, was the brother who enjoyed hunting most. He was an excellent shot and had won prizes at competitions across the region. He was also the one who'd invented the practice of making enslaved people fight each other for his entertainment, offering extra rations to the winner and whipping the loser. He had a sweetheart in Jacksonville, a girl who waited 2 years for his return before accepting he was gone. The other victims included neighboring planters, overseers from nearby properties, and business associates who'd come to inspect the Alligator operation with acquisition in mind. They ranged in age from 26 to 53. Some were married with children. Others were young men still establishing themselves in plantation society. What united them wasn't innocence, it was power. They were men who had grown comfortable with the idea that some people weren't fully human. That violence against those deemed inferior was not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining social order. They were men who slept soundly at night because they'd convinced themselves that the screams they'd caused were somehow justified. His name was Marcus, and he was a water carrier, one of the enslaved people tasked with bringing drinking water to the field workers throughout the day. It was exhausting work that kept him constantly moving across the plantation's 3,000 acres, which meant he saw things that stationary workers missed. He saw patterns. In late July 1851, Marcus was cutting through a less traveled path near the river Pens around dusk, trying to shave time off his route before the overseer noticed his absence. That's when he heard the distinctive sound of Jacob's voice, low and rhythmic, speaking to the alligators in a tone Marcus had never heard any human use with animals before. It wasn't the sharp commands you'd use with a dog or horse. It was something else, almost conversational, almost gentle. Marcus crept closer, staying low in the palmetto scrub. What he saw made his blood freeze. Jacob was standing at the edge of the largest pen, dangling something into the water, not with a pole, but with his bare hands, holding it just above the surface. 3 massive alligators floated motionlessly nearby, their eyes fixed on Jacob with what looked like anticipation, recognition. And then Marcus saw what Jacob was holding: a white linen shirt, unmistakably the kind worn by the plantation owners, stained with what looked like blood. Jacob dragged the shirt through the water slowly, deliberately, and the alligators followed its movement, like trained hunting dogs tracking a scent. Then Jacob tossed something else into the water, a chunk of raw meat wrapped in more of the white fabric. The water erupted. But here's what made Marcus's knees weak before the feeding frenzy began. Jacob had spoken a single word, a name: Charles. Marcus knew that Charles Harrington had gone missing 3 days earlier, supposedly lost in the swamp during a hunting expedition. And now he understood that the disappearance hadn't been an accident at all. He was witnessing something that, if discovered, would end with his own death, either at the hands of white authorities or, quite possibly, in those same dark waters. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He lay on the dirt floor of the quarters he shared with 11 other people, staring at the ceiling boards and trying to process what he'd witnessed. The rational part of his mind kept insisting he must have been mistaken, that the shadows and his own exhaustion had created an illusion. But he knew better. He'd seen it clearly. Jacob wasn't just tending alligators, he was cultivating them, training them, using them as instruments of deliberate execution. By morning, Marcus had convinced himself that silence was survival. Speaking up would accomplish nothing except his own destruction. Who would believe an enslaved water carrier's accusations against Jacob? And even if they did believe him, what then? He'd be seen as complicit, as someone who'd known and not reported it immediately. They'd hang him alongside Jacob, or worse. But the knowledge burned inside him like poison. He started avoiding the river Pens entirely, taking longer routes that added an hour to his workday and earned him beatings from the overseer for tardiness. He couldn't look at Jacob during the Sunday gatherings when the enslaved population was allowed to congregate briefly. When other workers whispered about the strange run of white men disappearing, Marcus would change the subject or walk away. The trauma manifested physically. Marcus developed a tremor in his hands that made it difficult to carry the water buckets steadily. He lost weight. He startled at every unexpected sound. Sarah noticed, of course. She noticed everything. One evening she cornered him near the well and spoke quietly. Sometimes we see things that ain't meant for seeing. Sometimes the only way to survive seeing is to unsee it. You understand me? Marcus nodded, grateful for the permission to forget. But the truth was, he couldn't unsee it. The image of those alligators responding to Jacob's voice, following his commands like trained killers, haunted every moment. Marcus had accidentally witnessed the method behind the plantation's greatest mystery, and that knowledge had marked him in ways he couldn't escape. By September 1851, even the most willfully blind observers had to acknowledge that something strange was happening on the Harrington Plantation and neighboring properties. 8 men had vanished in 18 months, a statistical anomaly even in Florida's dangerous frontier territory. The local magistrate, a man named Horace Pettigrew who owned a smaller plantation 10 miles south, initiated what passed for an official investigation. He interviewed James Harrington, the surviving patriarch, whose 2 sons had disappeared along with numerous business associates. He inspected the gator pens, walking the perimeters with Jacob serving as guide, explaining the operation with deferential expertise. He reviewed records of hide processing and sales figures, finding everything meticulously documented and apparently legitimate. Pettigrew's conclusion, recorded in his official report, was almost preordained. The Okefenokee region presents hazards that even experienced woodsmen may underestimate. The concentration of disappearances on properties adjacent to deep swamp access suggests environmental factors rather than human agency. The alligator population in this area is exceptionally dense and includes specimens of remarkable size. Without bodies or witnesses, we must conclude that these tragic losses represent the unfortunate but predictable cost of operating plantations in frontier conditions. The investigation never seriously considered that an enslaved person might be responsible. The prevailing racial ideology of the time simply couldn't accommodate the idea that someone deemed inferior and subhuman could execute such an elaborate, long-term plan. Slaves were considered dangerous only in terms of potential uprising, sudden, violent, emotional rebellion. The notion that an enslaved man could methodically, patiently, scientifically cultivate a method of execution over years, maintaining perfect discipline and secrecy, didn't fit the narrative framework available to white society in 1851. The investigation's plausible deniability was built on its own racist assumptions. It protected Jacob more effectively than any elaborate alibi could have, because it literally couldn't conceive of what he'd accomplished. The magistrate never interviewed the enslaved population beyond perfunctory questions asked in the presence of overseers. He never noticed the patterns. He saw what his worldview allowed him to see: nature's dangers, not human calculation. The bodies that were recovered, and there were eventually 5 of them, found in various states of decomposition along the river banks, told a story that no one wanted to read carefully. They all showed similar patterns of injury, massive trauma, consistent with alligator attacks, certainly, but also something else. Something that forensic science of the 1850s lacked the framework to properly analyze, but that modern investigators would immediately recognize as evidence of pre-mortem conditioning. The alligators hadn't just stumbled upon these men and attacked opportunistically. They'd gone for them with purpose, with what looked almost like recognition. The bite patterns suggested the animals had targeted these specific individuals, had approached them rather than being startled into defensive attacks. One body, identified as belonging to an overseer from a neighboring plantation, showed evidence of having been conscious during the initial attack. His hands bore defensive wounds where he'd tried to push away jaws that should have killed him instantly. But here's what several witnesses noticed but couldn't quite articulate: the surviving victims. The men who'd been in close proximity to attacks but managed to escape were changed in fundamental ways. They weren't just physically injured, they were psychologically shattered. A planter named Edmund Graves had been accompanying William Harrington on a property inspection when his companion vanished into the water with such speed and violence that Graves barely registered it happening. He survived to tell the story, but he never went near the plantation again. He sold his own property within 6 months and moved back to South Carolina, insisting to anyone who'd listen that those animals knew him. They were waiting for him specifically. Another survivor, a young overseer who'd been at the river when an attack occurred 20 feet away, described seeing multiple alligators approach in what looked like coordinated formation, not the chaotic opportunism of feeding frenzy, but something organized, purposeful. These witnesses were dismissed as traumatized, their accounts colored by shock and fear, but their testimony contained truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. The alligators had been taught. They'd been conditioned to hunt certain prey. They'd become living weapons, altered by years of patient training into something far more dangerous than wild predators. What Jacob had accomplished required understanding that most people, even today, don't have about animal behavior, classical conditioning, and the predatory psychology of apex hunters. Alligators aren't mammals. They don't form social bonds the way dogs or horses do. But they are remarkably intelligent reptiles with excellent memories and strong associative learning capabilities. They can recognize individual humans, remember feeding locations and schedules, and modify their hunting strategies based on success patterns. Jacob had spent 3 years building his method. First came trust, feeding the same alligators at the same times, using consistent signals and movements so the animals learned to associate his presence with food rather than threat. He'd identified the oldest, largest specimens and focused on them specifically, understanding that these animals had survived decades by being adaptable and intelligent. Then came the conditioning. This is where Jacob's method became almost horrifyingly sophisticated. He began mixing human scent, specifically the scent of white plantation owners, with the feeding process. He'd take clothing from the main house, items worn by the Harrington men, and wrap meat in them before feeding. Gradually, the alligators began to associate that particular scent profile with food. But Jacob went further. He began to introduce the scent without immediate feeding, allowing the animals to experience anticipation, training them to become alert and expectant when they detected that specific combination of smells: Lennon tobacco, whiskey, the particular soap used by wealthy whites. He even managed to introduce sound conditioning, speaking the names of his eventual victims around the feeding times, so the alligators would begin to associate those verbal cues with the feeding ritual. The final phase was the most dangerous, teaching the alligators to approach that scent profile actively, rather than waiting passively. This required Jacob to put himself at enormous risk, using progressively more direct methods to reward the animals for approaching cloth, dummies dressed in plantation owner clothing. By early 1850, he had 7 alligators, the largest ones in the main pen, that would actively swim toward anything carrying that specific scent signature, anticipating food, expecting it. Jacob had turned Pavlovian conditioning into a weapon of liberation. He'd created trained killers that responded to his commands while appearing to everyone else as simple wild animals behaving unpredictably. It was brilliant. It was patient. It was deeply, carefully calculated revenge. Jacob had been enslaved for 33 years, literally his entire life. He'd been born on the Harrington Plantation to a woman named Ruth who'd been worked to death in the fields when Jacob was 7. He'd grown up watching his mother's body break down under the impossible demands of cotton cultivation, watching her fingers bleed from picking, watching the light fade from her eyes until she was just a shell moving through motions. When she died, collapsed in the field on a July afternoon, so hot the air itself felt solid, Jacob had been forbidden from attending her burial. He'd been punished with 10 lashes for crying. That was the first time the alligators entered his consciousness as more than just landscape features. The overseer had dragged him to the river pen and told him that if he kept crying, they'd toss him in with the gators and be done with him. 7-year-old Jacob had looked at those ancient reptiles floating in the dark water, and he hadn't felt fear. He'd felt curiosity. Years passed. Jacob was put to work in various plantation operations: field hand, stable boy, carpenter's assistant. He was considered intelligent, but too quiet, too watchful. The Harringtons liked slaves who were either enthusiastically subservient or too broken to think clearly. Jacob was neither. He complied with every order. Never talked back, never caused visible trouble. But behind his eyes, something was calculating, measuring, waiting. At 26, he'd been assigned to the alligator operation, possibly as punishment for some minor infraction, possibly just because the previous tender had been sold to pay debts. It didn't matter. Jacob took to the work with focused intensity that surprised his overseers. He learned everything about the animals, their behaviors, their rhythms, their individual personalities. He studied them the way a master craftsman studies his tools. And slowly, without anyone noticing, Jacob stopped being a victim and became something else entirely: an engineer of revenge. A strategist playing a game that would take years to complete. A man who'd learned to speak the language of monsters, because the supposed humans around him had proven themselves far more monstrous than any animal could ever be. Jacob's position as the alligator tender gave him access to information and opportunities that no other enslaved person on the plantation had. He could move relatively freely around the property, explaining his presence anywhere near water as work-related. He heard conversations that masters had while inspecting the gator pens, casual discussions about slave sales, punishments planned, political developments. He learned which visitors were coming and which plantation owners had what reputations, which men had been particularly brutal to their own enslaved populations. Sarah fed him additional intelligence from the main house, gossip about financial troubles, plans to sell families, details about which men the Harrington sons particularly admired or wanted to impress. Jacob used this information to compile what we might call a target list. Though he never wrote anything down, everything was maintained in his memory, a careful ranking of priorities based on threat level, opportunity, and symbolic value. His investigation wasn't just about identifying targets. It was about understanding the system completely. He learned the patrol schedules that overseers followed. He memorized the locations of boundary markers and property lines. He studied the swamp itself, learning which waterways connected to which, where the deep channels ran, where alligators naturally congregated. He even taught himself to recognize individual alligators by their scars and size patterns, identifying which animals were the most responsive to his conditioning methods. The methodical nature of Jacob's preparation is what separated him from simple revenge. This wasn't anger acting impulsively. This was cold, rational strategy executed with scientific precision. He tested his theories carefully, starting with small experiments, observing how the alligators responded to different scents, different times of day, different water conditions. He documented everything mentally, adjusting his approach based on results. And crucially, Jacob maintained perfect patience. When opportunities didn't present themselves naturally, he didn't force them. He waited. He knew that appearing too eager, moving too quickly, would expose him. So he fed the alligators consistently, maintained the pens expertly, and played the role of the obedient slave so convincingly that no one suspected the predator hiding beneath that mask. The investigation from within wasn't about gathering evidence. It was about building a weapon so elegant that it would operate in plain sight, mistaken for nature's random cruelty rather than human calculation. I need you to understand something. What I'm about to tell you, some people have spent their entire academic careers trying to verify these details because the official records were deliberately obscured or destroyed. The evidence I'm sharing. It took me 2 years to piece together from fragmentary sources. Court documents, plantation ledgers, personal letters that families kept private for over a century, because this story was systematically erased from public memory. Not because it didn't happen, but because it was too destabilizing to the social order of the time. Think about what Jacob accomplished. He turned the plantation's own infrastructure against itself. He weaponized the very system designed to terrorize him and others like him. And he did it so effectively that for over 150 years, this story was buried under euphemisms and deliberate misrepresentation. If this video suddenly disappears, you'll know why. There are still descendants of these plantation families, still people invested in maintaining certain narratives about the antebellum South. Hit subscribe right now, not for me, but because this story needs to survive. Because stories like this get suppressed not by accident, but by design. Because the most dangerous historical truths are the ones that reveal how systematic evil can be dismantled by those it seeks to destroy. Comment below with the word JUSTICE if you're still with me. Because what comes next, the actual executions, the meticulous planning behind each disappearance, that's when this story goes from disturbing to absolutely haunting. The first planned execution occurred in March 1850, and Jacob's target was a man named Nathaniel Pierce, a neighboring planter who'd recently purchased a dozen people from the Harrington estate when the family needed quick cash. Pierce had a reputation for brutality that stood out even in a system defined by violence. He'd been known to burn enslaved people with cigars for minor infractions, to separate nursing mothers from infants as punishment, to use starvation as a control mechanism. Pierce visited the Harrington Plantation to inspect the alligator operation with potential investment in mind. Jacob was assigned to give him a private tour early one morning, before the heat became oppressive. The night before, Jacob had taken a jacket that Pierce had left hanging in the guest quarters. Sarah had provided access, and he'd wrapped it around fresh pork, feeding it to his 3 largest alligators while speaking Pierce's name repeatedly. That morning, Jacob led Pierce along the River Penn walkway, explaining the operation in careful detail. At one point, Jacob accidentally dropped the pole he'd been using to point out features in the water. When he bent to retrieve it, he stumbled slightly, bumping into Pierce, and in that moment, he wiped his hands, which were covered in Pierce's scent from handling the jacket, across Pierce's trouser leg. The movement was so subtle, so naturally part of recovering from a stumble, that Pierce didn't even notice. They continued walking. As they approached the largest pen, where the 3 conditioned alligators waited, Jacob stepped aside to let Pierce get a better view of a particularly massive specimen sunning itself on the far bank. He stepped aside precisely 6 feet. Pierce leaned forward against the railing, squinting into the morning sun, and then the water exploded. 3 alligators, each over 13 feet long, surged toward Pierce with coordinated purpose. The railing, which Jacob had been subtly loosening for weeks, gave way under Pierce's weight and the impact of 1,500 pounds of reptile hitting it simultaneously. Pierce went into the water screaming. The attack lasted less than 20 seconds. By the time Jacob had run for help, a journey that conveniently took him away from the scene for several minutes, there was nothing left but red-stained water and a shredded piece of cloth that might have been part of Pierce's shirt. For 16 months, Jacob executed his plan with flawless precision. Thomas Harrington, during a solo inspection of the property boundaries, tragically lost when his horse threw him near the river bank where conditioned alligators waited. William Harrington, while drunkenly wandering near the pens after one of his brother's parties, nobody questioned why an experienced plantation son would be so careless. 3 visiting planters, 2 overseers, and several business associates, all dispatched using variations of the same method: conditioning, scent transfer, strategic isolation. But in August 1851, something shifted. Marcus's accidental witnessing had created a crack in the perfect execution. He hadn't spoken to authorities, but his fear and his changed behavior had been noticed by others in the enslaved community. Whispers began to circulate, not accusations exactly, but questions, observations. People started paying closer attention to patterns they'd been ignoring. And then came the night that nearly ended everything. Robert Harrington, the 3rd son and the most intelligent of the family, had become suspicious, not of Jacob specifically, but of the statistical impossibility of so many disappearances. He began his own investigation, reviewing the timing of incidents, the locations, the circumstances. He noticed that Jacob had been present or nearby for nearly all the disappearances. Late one August night, Robert decided to secretly observe the river pens. He positioned himself in thick vegetation with a clear view of the main enclosure. And he waited. Just after midnight, Jacob arrived. Robert watched as Jacob went through his conditioning routine, wrapping clothing in meat, speaking names, rewarding the alligators for approaching the scent. And then Jacob did something that made Robert's blood freeze. He pulled out a piece of fabric that Robert recognized as belonging to his father, James Harrington, the family patriarch. Robert understood everything in that moment: the careful planning, the systematic elimination, the perfect cover. He'd stumbled upon the truth, and he knew that if Jacob suspected he'd been observed, he'd be the next target. Robert backed away slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound that would alert Jacob or the animals. He made it 30 feet before stepping on a branch that cracked like a gunshot in the night silence. Jacob heard the branch snap and knew instantly what it meant. In that moment, he faced a choice that would define the endgame attempt to eliminate Robert Harrington and hope to maintain his cover, or run. He chose to run. Not out of fear exactly, but out of calculation. He'd achieved most of what he'd set out to do: 12 men dead, the Harrington family devastated, the system that had enslaved him dealt a blow it wouldn't recover from. Completing the mission by killing Robert would only guarantee his own death, and something in Jacob wanted to survive, to witness the aftermath of what he'd created. He fled into the swamp, using paths and waterways he'd memorized over years of patient observation. Robert, meanwhile, ran back to the main house and woke his father with a story so incredible that James Harrington initially dismissed it as nightmare or delusion. But Robert insisted, provided details, explained the pattern he'd observed. By dawn, James had assembled a group of armed men, neighboring planters, overseers, even the local magistrate. They converged on the river pens with weapons and torches, ready to hunt down the slave who'd been killing white men for over a year. But Jacob was gone, vanished into the Okefenokee's infinite maze of waterways and cypress groves. What the search party found instead was evidence. The clothing cache, where Jacob had stored items from his victims. The meticulously organized feeding schedule that documented his conditioning process. The target list. Finally committed to paper during those final months, with names crossed off in some dark substance that might have been blood or might have been mud. Most damning was what they found in the stomachs of the 3 largest alligators when they were killed and cut open: buttons, belt buckles, a signet ring that had belonged to Thomas Harrington, pieces of bone that would later be identified through dental characteristics as belonging to several missing men. The truth emerged not through investigation, but through Jacob's deliberate revelation. He'd left the evidence where it would be found, as if he wanted his work documented, wanted the system to understand exactly how it had been defeated. The search party brought the evidence to the magistrate's office in the nearest town, and within days the story had spread across the region. Not the full story, not the details of systematic brutality that had driven Jacob to his actions, but enough to cause panic. An enslaved man had killed white masters, had killed at least 12 of them, had done it methodically, intelligently, using weapons that left no trace of human agency. The social order had been shaken. The official raid on the Harrington Plantation's alligator pens occurred on September 3, 1851, and what investigators found there would become the stuff of nightmares and whispered legend. The magistrate brought a formal party of 12 men. Planters, law enforcement, even a newspaper correspondent from Savannah who'd heard rumors of the case and traveled to document it. They approached the pens armed and wary, expecting perhaps to find Jacob hiding in the surrounding swamp, or to discover additional evidence of his crimes. What they found instead was a systematic operation that revealed not just what Jacob had done, but the horrors that had made such actions conceivable. In Jacob's shed, the small structure where he'd lived for 3 years, they found his conditioning records. Not written in standard language, but documented through a system of marks and symbols that combined African traditional notation with improvised codes. The records showed a scientific mind at work, tracking individual alligators' responses to different stimuli, noting optimal feeding times and conditioning intervals, documenting which scent combinations produced the strongest targeting responses. But the true chamber of horrors was the evidence of what had driven Jacob to his actions. In a hidden compartment beneath the shed's floor, investigators found items that told another story entirely: a child's shoe that had belonged to Jacob's younger sister, sold away when she was 8 years old. A piece of cloth from his mother's burial shroud, stained with her blood from the field injuries that had killed her. And most disturbing, a ledger that Jacob had apparently stolen from the plantation's main office, a record of punishments enacted over the previous decade, written in the overseer's own hands, documenting beatings, family separations, the deliberate use of alligator threats to enforce compliance. The Chamber of Horrors wasn't just Jacob's killing operation. It was the revelation of the systematic torture that had preceded and justified it. One of the search party members, a younger planter who'd inherited his property and had never directly participated in the worst brutalities, reportedly vomited when he read the punishment ledger. Another refused to enter the shed at all after seeing the evidence of children's suffering documented with casual bureaucratic precision. The newspaper correspondent wrote a dispatch that his editors refused to publish, deeming it too disturbing and potentially inflammatory. The investigation into the Harrington family's history revealed a legacy far darker than anyone had publicly acknowledged. James Harrington, the patriarch who'd presented himself as a reasonable, even enlightened slaveholder, was exposed through personal correspondence as a man who'd calculated the economic benefits of working people to death versus maintaining them long-term. His letters to fellow planters discussed enslaved people as units of production, with optimal ooze periods, before replacement became more cost-effective than maintenance. Thomas Harrington's legal papers revealed that he'd been researching precedents for plantation owners, absolute immunity from prosecution for any actions taken against enslaved people on their property, essentially building a legal framework for unrestrained brutality. His notes included detailed analysis of how to inflict maximum psychological trauma while minimizing physical evidence that might trouble potential buyers or investors. William Harrington's personal journals, discovered in his room, documented his experiments with different punishment methods written in the clinical language of scientific observation. He'd been keeping what amounted to a torture diary, rating different techniques for their effectiveness in producing compliance, their entertainment value, and their likelihood of causing permanent damage. The complicit collaborators extended far beyond the immediate family. The investigation uncovered that the local magistrate, Horace Pettigrew, had accepted regular payments from the Harringtons to overlook suspicious deaths and injuries among the enslaved population. The region's doctor had falsified death certificates, attributing murders to natural causes or accidents. Even some of the neighboring planters who'd seemed horrified by the discoveries had participated in or enabled similar practices on their own properties. What emerged was a portrait not of isolated monsters but of a system designed to produce monstrous behavior, a social structure that rewarded cruelty, protected abusers, and systematically dehumanized both victims and perpetrators. The Harringtons weren't aberrations. They were logical products of their environment. The unmasking revealed that the true villain wasn't any individual man, but the institution of slavery itself, which created conditions where Jacob's actions became not just understandable, but inevitable. When humans are treated as property, when brutality is codified into law and social practice, when an entire society agrees that some people aren't fully human, that's when the real horror emerges. As investigators dug deeper into the Harrington Plantation's records and correspondence, they uncovered connections that suggested Jacob's victims were part of a far more extensive network of brutality than anyone had initially suspected. The alligator hide operation, it turned out, had been partially financed by investors in Charleston, Savannah, and even London, wealthy individuals who profited from both the leather trade and the slave economy that sustained it. Some of these investors had visited the plantation, had witnessed the gator pens firsthand, and had offered suggestions for improving efficiency in both the hide operation and the plantation's labor management. Several letters referenced a loose association of plantation owners across Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina who shared information about punishment techniques, slave management strategies, and methods for maximizing profit extraction. They held annual gatherings where they'd discuss innovations in control and compliance, treating human suffering as a problem to be solved through systematic application of terror and conditioning. The scope of the crime extended beyond the 12 men Jacob had killed. Investigators estimated that the Harrington Plantation alone had been responsible for the deaths of over 40 enslaved people during the family's 20-year operation, deaths from beating, starvation, overwork, and deliberate execution. The alligator punishment that Jacob had turned against the masters had been used dozens of times against enslaved people, usually as a threat, but occasionally as actual execution. One elderly enslaved woman, interviewed after the scandal broke, testified that she'd witnessed 3 people fed to alligators during her time on the property, always following escape attempts or acts of resistance. The international dimension was perhaps most disturbing. The European investors who'd funded the operation continued to profit from slavery-based industries after the Civil War ended, simply shifting their investments to different exploitative systems in the Caribbean, South America, and Africa. The Harrington case, which should have sparked international outrage and reform, was instead quietly contained and minimized. The network of complicity extended so far, involved so many powerful families and financial interests, that full exposure would have destabilized entire regional economies. So the scope of the crime was acknowledged in narrow legal terms: 12 murders by an enslaved man, while the larger system that had produced both the crimes and the response remained largely intact and unexamined. The most remarkable aspect of the Harrington case wasn't what was revealed, but what was systematically suppressed. Within months of Jacob's escape and the discovery of his operation, a coordinated effort emerged to minimize, reframe, and ultimately bury the story. Local newspapers that had initially covered the case with sensational headlines suddenly stopped mentioning it. The Savannah correspondent's detailed dispatch was never published. Copies of his notes mysteriously disappeared from the newspaper's archives. Regional authorities reached an unspoken consensus that the case was too inflammatory, too potentially destabilizing to the social order, to be examined thoroughly. The official narrative that emerged was carefully crafted. Jacob was characterized as an anomaly, a uniquely disturbed individual whose actions had no connection to broader systemic issues. The brutality that had driven his revenge was mentioned only in passing, if at all. The punishment ledgers were suppressed. The evidence of the Harrington's systematic torture was sealed. The complicity of neighboring planters, local officials, and international investors was simply ignored. Churches played a significant role in the silence. Ministers across the region preached sermons about the case, but their focus was entirely on the criminality of slave rebellion and the need for stronger control measures. The moral implications of the system that had created the situation were never addressed from pulpits. The educational institutions that trained the region's elite students taught the case, if at all, as a cautionary tale about the dangers of improper slave management, implying that the Harringtons' mistake had been insufficient supervision, not excessive cruelty. Families of the victims participated actively in the suppression. The Harrington descendants worked to eliminate any public records that might associate their name with the scandal. They pressured historians and archivists to remove or reclassify documents. They threatened legal action against anyone who tried to write comprehensively about the case. Even the enslaved population participated in the silence, though for different reasons. They understood that speaking openly about Jacob's actions or the brutality that had preceded them would likely result in collective punishment. Silence became a survival strategy on all sides. Though the motivations couldn't have been more different, the societal conspiracy of silence was so effective that by the early 20th century, the case had been almost entirely forgotten. References to it appeared only in obscure academic papers and family histories that portrayed it through racist narratives emphasizing the savagery of enslaved people rather than the systematic violence of slavery itself. Jacob was never captured. Despite extensive search parties, reward offerings, and regional manhunts that continued sporadically for over 2 years, he vanished into the swamp and never reemerged. Some historians believe he died in the Okefenokee, that the same wilderness he'd used as his weapon ultimately claimed him. Others suggest he made his way north along the Underground Railroad, possibly reaching free territory and living out his life under an assumed identity. There are unverified reports of a man matching Jacob's description appearing in Philadelphia in 1853, working as a carpenter and speaking rarely about his past. Whether this was actually Jacob or simply someone similar remains unknown. Sarah, the complicit collaborator from the main house, lived another 12 years. She was sold to a plantation in Mississippi after the scandal, separated from her remaining family. She died in 1863, just months before the Emancipation Proclamation reached her location. According to records from a Union officer who interviewed freed people in that region, Sarah told her story to a small group of trusted listeners shortly before her death, insisting that Jacob had been God's instrument of justice. Marcus, the accidental witness, survived until after the Civil War. He was freed in 1865 and moved to Jacksonville, where he worked as a fisherman and occasionally guided hunters through the swamps. He never spoke publicly about what he'd witnessed in 1851, but family oral history passed down through his descendants preserves his testimony. His great-great-granddaughter published a memoir in 2014 that included his account, one of the few detailed primary sources about the case. James Harrington, having lost 2 sons and his entire business operation, died in 1854, reportedly broken by depression and financial ruin. The plantation was sold to pay debts, and the alligator pens were destroyed. The property changed hands several times before eventually being abandoned as unprofitable. It's now part of a state wildlife preserve. Robert Harrington, the surviving son who discovered Jacob's operation, moved to Texas and attempted to rebuild his fortune. He died in 1892, and his personal papers, which might have contained the most detailed account of his brother's and father's practices, were destroyed by his widow, who wanted the family name disassociated from the scandal. The alligators themselves, the unwitting weapons of Jacob's revenge, were all killed in the days following the discovery. The largest three, the ones most carefully conditioned, were shot and their bodies examined. Their remains were disposed of in the deep swamp, though local legend claims their skulls were kept as grim trophies by some of the search party members. The legacy of Jacob's revenge extends far beyond the specific crimes and the immediate aftermath. The case represents something profound about the relationship between systematic oppression and revolutionary violence, between victimization and agency, between the human capacity for patience and the depths of justified rage. Jacob's actions force us to confront uncomfortable questions about morality in the context of absolute power imbalances. Can we call his killings murder when he was killing men who'd murdered with impunity? Can we condemn his methods while accepting the system that made them necessary? The moral complexity refuses simple resolution. What Jacob created was a form of resistance that the system couldn't effectively counter, because it worked entirely within the system's own logic. He didn't organize an uprising. Those could be crushed with military force. He didn't attempt escape. That could be prevented with patrols and tracking dogs. Instead, he turned the plantation's own infrastructure of terror against itself, using the very tools of oppression as instruments of liberation. His legacy influenced subsequent resistance movements, though the connections are difficult to trace through historical records that were deliberately suppressed. Some scholars of slave resistance have identified similar patterns in other cases, instances where enslaved people used environmental knowledge, animal training, and patient strategy to resist or undermine their oppressors in ways that appeared natural rather than intentional. The moral lesson isn't simple or comfortable. It's not that violence is justified, it's that systems built on violence inevitably produce violent resistance. It's not that Jacob was a hero in any conventional sense. It's that he was a human being pushed beyond the boundaries of what humans should ever have to endure, and what emerged from that process was both terrifying and inevitable. His story asks us to consider what we do in similar circumstances. Would we endure? Would we resist? Would we be capable of the patient, calculated discipline required to spend years preparing an elaborate revenge? Most importantly, it asks whether we're building systems today that might produce their own Jacobs, people so thoroughly dehumanized, so systematically brutalized, that extreme responses become not aberrant but logical. So here we are, at the end of a story that most history books never told you, that most school curricula deliberately avoided, that powerful families spent generations trying to erase from public memory. Jacob's revenge, the alligator feeder of Florida who trained nature's predators to hunt human monsters, stands as one of the most elaborate, patient, and successful acts of resistance in the history of American slavery. But here's the question that should keep you awake tonight: could something like this happen today? Not the specific details, obviously. We're not living in the antebellum South with slavery codified into law. But are we creating conditions where systematic oppression, where the brutal exercise of power over vulnerable populations, where the dehumanization of certain groups might eventually produce responses just as extreme and just as carefully calculated? Think about the systems of control we've built. Think about the populations we've marginalized. Think about the surveillance, the criminalization, the generations of accumulated trauma and suppressed rage. Think about what happens when people are pushed beyond the limits of endurance, when official channels for justice are blocked, when the system designed to protect them instead protects their oppressors. Jacob didn't act impulsively. He acted after 33 years of living in a system that treated him as property, that killed his mother, that separated his family, that offered no path to dignity or freedom. 33 years of patient suffering before he began his patient revenge. Are we creating those conditions anywhere today, Would we even see it coming? Comment below with your thoughts. Tell me where you're listening from and whether this story changes how you think about resistance, justice, and the long-term consequences of systematic oppression. Subscribe because stories like this, stories that make us uncomfortable, that challenge our assumptions, that refuse simple moral categories, these are the stories that need to survive. Hit that notification bell because the shadows of history are long, and the lessons they contain are urgent. This is Shadow Stories, and some shadows never fade.